April 19th, 2018. A trailer door drops on a stretch of the Betpak-Dala steppe, so cracked and pale, a survey team had already marked it dead. And 30 SAIGA antelope spill out onto dirt that hasn't held a wild herd in a generation. If comeback stories like this one land for you, do subscribe. There are more of these than you'd believe, and it genuinely helps me keep making them. Everyone watching expected the same thing. Scatter, thin out, vanish. 30 animals on a landscape that hadn't felt a grazing hoof in a generation. The odds weren't just bad. They were a foregone conclusion. Someone had drawn a line on a map through that ground and written a single word beside it: dead. Survival, it turned out, was the easy part. What none of the botanists standing on that steppe could explain was what came up out of that soil 2 springs later. I won't tell you yet, but it made grown scientists kneel down and pull their own baseline data back out twice, because the ground they'd written off had done something the paperwork said was impossible. Hold that, we're coming back to it. I'm Peter, and this is the full story of how 30 of the strangest-looking animals on Earth woke a dead steppe back to life. I've spent a long time out on grasslands like this one, and I can tell you the steppe doesn't give up its secrets easily. This one did, slowly, and in an order nobody predicted. So, here's the walk we're going to take. First, the fall. How something this old and this tough came within a whisker of being gone for good. Then the one piece of science almost nobody has heard, the mechanism that explains everything that followed. And finally, the bloom itself, the thing the survey said couldn't happen. But before any of that, you need to understand what a SAIGA actually is. Because if you're picturing something graceful, a slender, desert, gazelle, ears back, running, put that image down. Picture instead a creature that looks half-finished. Short-legged, sandy, about the size of a large sheep, with a nose like nothing else alive. A soft, bulbous, drooping snout that hangs down over its mouth like a small trunk that never quite grew. It looks, honestly, a little ridiculous, comical. The kind of animal a child would draw wrong on purpose. That nose is not a joke. In summer, when the steppe throws up walls of dust, it filters the air clean before it ever reaches the lungs. In winter, when the temperature drops far below freezing, it warms the incoming breath so the animal doesn't scorch its own insides on the cold. It is a piece of engineering wearing the disguise of a punchline. And that word, engineering, is the whole story. That bulbous, comical, big-nosed antelope you're picturing, it isn't a guest on the grassland, it's the builder. Most of us think of a place like this as a stage, and the animals as the actors moving across it. Wrong way round. On the steppe, the SAIGA is not living on the grassland. The SAIGA is making it. Its hooves and its gut do something to that land that no plow, no seed drill, no tractor full of expert intentions has ever managed to copy. I'll show you exactly what. And it's stranger and simpler than you'd guess. Remember that. The animal builds the ground it stands on, which is why the map was wrong. The steppe wasn't dead. It was just waiting for the right feet. But to understand the miracle 2 springs later, you have to understand how close the SAIGA came to never walking this steppe again. Because 3 years before that trailer door dropped, in a single fortnight in May of 2015, something inside the animal's own throats turned on them. It didn't come from outside. No predator, no drought, no poacher. The killer was already living inside them, quiet and harmless, riding along in the throat of every animal on the steppe. May 2015. A bacterium called Pasturella multocida, a thing the SAIGA had carried without harm for as long as anyone had records turned. Nobody's fully sure why. A warm, wet spring, some say. Whatever the trigger, it went lethal in the space of days. And it didn't take a few. It took roughly 200,000 animals in 3 weeks, over 60% of the entire world population gone in a fortnight. Walk that ground afterward, and you'd see them scattered to the horizon. Whole calving herds dropped where they stood. The steppe went quiet. And quiet, out there, is a kind of death you can hear. Then came the part almost nobody talks about, because it's slow and it isn't dramatic. Without the herd, the grass didn't flourish. It smothered. It grew rank, matted, layer on layer of dead thatch. Nobody was there to crop. Light couldn't reach the soil. Seeds couldn't reach the sun. A grassland with no grazers doesn't bloom. It chokes itself out under its own uncut growth. So here's the question that gnawed at me. How does removing an animal kill the plants? Grass doesn't need antelope. Or so you'd think. Here's the part most people have never heard. A SAIGA herd isn't a resident of that grassland. It's a machine that builds it. Ecologists have a clumsy phrase for what it does: habitat heterogeneity. In plain terms, the herd breaks one flat, uniform stretch of ground into 1,000 tiny, different conditions. And life needs that difference to get going. Watch how. They crop the tall grass down, so sunlight finally lands on bare soil. Their sharp hooves punch small hollows into the dirt little pockets, each one a cup that catches snowmelt and holds it long enough for a root to drink. And the gut does the strangest work of all. A SAIGA eats a tulip seed, a feathergrass seed, and carries it for miles. The acid in its stomach scratches the tough coat, scarifies it, which is exactly what a seed needs to sprout. Then it drops that seed, softened and wrapped in fertilizer, onto ground it would never have reached on its own. A hoof, a gut, a wandering appetite. That's the machinery, and no tractor on earth can copy it. Because a tractor moves in straight lines and a herd moves like weather. Now, this could sound like a nice story I'm telling you, so let's put a number on it. Picture the same square of steppe with the herd, and without it, that gap is the whole story. Researcher Igor Jumabayeva did exactly that. In a 2022 paper in PNAS, her team compared soil the SAIGA had worked against fenced plots, where no animal was allowed to walk. The worked ground held 34% more germinating seeds than the fenced, ungrazed plots right beside it. Same rain, same sun, same dirt. The only difference was feet, which brings us to the fix. And this is the part that's almost embarrassing once you understand the machine. No irrigation, no replanting, no 20-year management plan, no committees, no seed drilling rigs hauled across the steppe. The solution was smaller than any of that. Put the animals back. Get out of the way. That's it. That was the whole plan. After a die-off that erased over half the species in a fortnight, the recovery came down to a door and some patience. And so a team drove out to the Betpak Dala, to that cracked, pale stretch. A survey crew had already crossed off as dead, no seed bank worth counting, no recovery expected. Not the good ground. The written-off ground. The ground everyone agreed was beyond saving. They opened the trailer. 30 animals stepped down onto it. 30, against a loss of 200,000. It looked less like a rescue and more like a rounding error. And then everyone waited. 1 season. 2. By the second spring, the dead ground was doing something the botanists could not reconcile with their own baseline. It started with a color no one had recorded on that soil for a generation. Green. On soil, a survey team had marked dead. On plots crossed off with a pen, green came up first, then color on top of it, spilling wide. Sventoi tulips, flaring low and red. Feathergrass, silver and moving in the wind. Wild licorice, threading between them. And when the botanists went back with their measuring frames and their clipboards, they found something they genuinely couldn't square with their own numbers. a 41% jump in plant diversity against the baseline, 41% on ground they'd written off entirely. They checked it. Then they checked it again. There's a particular kind of quiet that comes over a scientist who trusts their instrument, trusts their method, and cannot trust the result in front of them. That's what happened out there. Grown researchers standing on cracked dirt that had bloomed, going back through their figures a second and a third time because the steppe had done in 2 seasons what their baseline said should take a decade of careful management, or never happen at all. And here's the part that to me lands hardest. Nobody planted any of it. No one seeded those tulips. No one carried in the feather grass. The SAIGA did that, cropping the tall growth so light hit the soil, punching hollows with their hooves that caught the snowmelt, carrying seed in their gut, scarified and fertilized, dropping it across miles of the Betpak Dala. 30 animals, working the ground like it was theirs, because it was. And then the ground started calling in the rest. Ground-nesting larks came back over that grassland. Pin-tailed sandgrouse dropped in over the restored plots. Birds nobody had recorded there in years. Nobody planted them either. Nobody called them home. They simply found a steppe that worked again, and they moved in. That's the thing about an ecosystem, hand it back its engineer, and it doesn't wait for permission. Now, I want to be honest about what this story does not solve. 30 animals is nothing. 30 is a rounding error. One more disease event, like the one that took 200,000 of them in a fortnight, and this whole bloom collapses back into pale dirt. One hard winter, with poachers out for their horns, and there is always a market for those horns, always someone with a rifle and weathered hands who'll take one, and the herd is gone again. Recovery is not the same as safety. A steppe that bloomed once can be unbloomed. I'd be lying to you if I dressed this up as a finished thing. It isn't. It's a fragile, beautiful start, standing on the survival of a few dozen big-nosed animals that nearly vanished for good. But then there's this, and this is the part I can't quite shake. In the old Kazakh of that region, there's a word for the SAIGA, outperformed, and the herders who lived out there, who watched the herds thin and die and finally disappear when they moved away, they kept using that word, not for the animal anymore, for the land itself. They called the empty ground outperformed, long after there wasn't a single SAIGA left to see. A word for an animal quietly transferred to the place the animal used to be, as if the language was holding a seat open. The word outlasted the herd. Then the herd came back to meet the word. Think about that. The name waited on that steppe for a generation, carried in the mouths of people who'd given up on ever seeing the real thing again. And then 30 of them stepped out of a trailer onto cracked, pale dirt, the same dirt a survey had called dead, and walked back into their own name. That, to me, is the heart of it. The ground was never dead. It was just waiting for the right feet. Picture that trailer door dropping open again. April, central Kazakhstan, 30 SAIGA spilling out onto ground, so dry the experts had crossed it off. Everyone expected them to scatter and vanish. Instead, they stayed, and they built, and the land turned green in a color no one had recorded there in a generation. Tell me in the comments where you'd bring a herd like this back. What dead ground near you might just be waiting for the right feet. And if this moved you, subscribe. There are more of these comeback stories than you'd believe, and I'll keep telling them. Thanks for watching.